Now, given context to the picture that you are currently looking at right now, okay, you have five championship UFC belts, and they're all undisputed championships. I don't have a picture of any of the champions, and I'm going to tell you in a little bit why. The other one, you have a picture of undisputed champions within boxing. And the difference between the undisputed champions in boxing as opposed to MMA and in particular the UFC is that the boxing uh, undisputed champions have more of a name, and primarily because they have to carry four other belts, and by the way, belts that they have to pay for in a sanctioning fee. So the other question is, why do I have five belts up here as opposed to the belts of all the divisions represented in the UFC? I'm going to tell you why. The UFC started out with just a couple of weight classes. And when they started really blowing up, they had realistically only five weight classes, which was the 155 championship, which was the lowest division that you could possibly fight at. And this is all the way dating back till 2009, 2008. And then you can go back and see that they only had 155ers, they had 170 champions, 185ers, 205, and then the heavyweight division. And that was it. But the difference between that and boxing is that in boxing, you got to win a little more than just one belt in order to be considered undisputed, as opposed to the UFC where you are considered undisputed if you just win one belt in one particular weight class that you're in. And then the variations of moving up different weight classes and winning other undisputed championships is another story in and of itself. But nonetheless, there's no names or faces in the UFC in this particular picture as opposed to boxing, because I'm going to tell you, in MMA, the way that they designed the sport, it is as if anybody can win these titles at any given time. And this weekend's result with Sean Strickland and everything that played out into that situation, I think was a marvelous example of that. Oftentimes, people forget that, in the words of Leon Edwards, the pound for pound championship doesn't belong to anybody, or I'm sorry, the pound for pound position in the ranking systems, in the weekly ranking systems of the UFC and other MMA journalists around the world. It doesn't belong to anyone, because one thing that you got to understand, and something that a lot of guys who train and a lot of guys who compete and a lot of guys who are active in the gyms on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, understand that at any given time, anybody can take on anybody and give them the best of your day. And then on top of that, one guy is going to get one over the other guy, unless, of course, if you're Khabib, and many other people out there are going to have contrasting views of that. They'll say, well, how is that possible? He's never lost a round, or this and that. But that's what they say about Khabib. He's never lost a round in the gym. But for everyone else, that's not Khabib. I think it's also important to understand that you can lose, and there is a possibility of you losing just like anybody else that's human on any given day, especially at a gym where, let's say, okay, I did hill sprints that day and in a weight training session. Now I'm coming into a sparring match with you, and now you're coming in there fresh. You just came from a cryotherapy. You had a cold shower. You had a nice stretch. You didn't work out as hard the day before, and then you get the best of me. This is a reality that goes on in gyms around the world. So this is why I say that there is no such thing as the greatest of all time. It's just an illusion that doesn't exist. And then on top of that, here's another thing you got to take into consideration. How about Arthur Beterbiev? This guy has a 100% knockout ratio. And the problem is nobody knows him, because boxing is a sport where nobody really wants to fight anybody. Now, as opposed to Israel Adesanya, you look at what he did prior to him going in there with Sean Strickland. And by the way, big kudos and credit to Sean Strickland, because he proved that this sport is all about a daily meritocracy, meaning that what you did the days prior before will not matter when we have to reset again and do that fight in the gym. It's a different sparring session now. It's a different atmosphere. It's a different feeling. It's a different understanding of ranges and everything in between. So, this is why I thought it was great to relate this story to the book that I recently read about illusions. And that is the title, Champions of Illusions by Suzanne Martinez Conde and Stephen Macknick. So check it out on all the bookstores that are available. Yeah, Champions of Illusion. So this has nothing to do with combat sports, but the reason why I thought it was important to bring up was because there was an inspiration to trying to understand modern combat sports with this, right? And the way that the book is described, it's a full color celebration of stunning visual illusions and science that is behind them in The Champions of Illusion, written by Susanna Summer and Stephen Macknick, the people that I just mentioned, present um, a smorgasbord of mystifying images, many selected from their best illusion of the year contest, whether it's false motion. Okay. This is something that Israel Adesanya likes to do, tricks of perspective, something that a lot of great strikers have a great matter of shifting colors. Champions of Illusion is packed with adventures in visual perception. So if you ever found yourself face to face with utterly bewildering illusions, you know the powerful effect such images have on your mind. Now, the question we often ask ourselves is, how is that possible? And what Martinez and Macknick study the intersections of neuroscience, illusions, stage magic, and explain just why we think we see things the way we see them. And the Best Illusion of the Year contest draws entries from, let's say, the visions of a scientist, artists, magicians, mathematicians bent on creating today's most beguiling illusions, featuring contests' most bizarre effects and unbelievable mind tricks, along with classic illusions and illuminating descriptions of what is actually going on in your brain when you are deceived by the visuals of the page. And this is what Champions of Illusion is, an electrifying mix of science, magic that you will not soon forget. So check out that book. I thought the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because this is the reality of how a lot of people really convey combat sports, especially when you become a prisoner and a captive of a moment. So right now, you are a captive and a prisoner of the moment because you think that Israel Adesanya is the worst fighter ever and his coach needs to rethink everything that he does, even though the guy has a winning record in terms of how he performed that night with the other fighters, such as Shane Young and Carlos Ulberg and all the other guys that were in City Kickboxing in Auckland, New Zealand. Right? But then you judge this one thing that he did with Israel Adesanya when Israel Adesanya constantly had to do all these fights. You look at the list of all the fights that Israel Adesanya has had over the years. It is an absolutely tiring endeavor to deal with. So you got to think this factor plays into everything that I had just mentioned earlier in the audio where I mentioned to the effect of, let's say I was already doing hill sprints, doing a weight training session, and I come in for a sparring match and you get the best of me. This is the reality of combat sports gyms around the world and sparring sessions amongst boxers, MMA fighters, Muay Thai fighters, amateur wrestlers, jiu-jitsu guys, lethway fighters, bare knuckle fighters. The list goes on of all the different competitors. That's the reality of things. So one thing you got to understand is that a lot of these champions that you see that look mighty in the night of the fight and the performances that are one of the best highlights that they can put out there, you got to take into consideration also they have their days. Everybody gets tired. Everybody dwindles down at a certain point. And on top of that, on any given day, anybody can take on anybody. And I mentioned how Mike Tyson has mentioned this plenty of times in his camps where he's fought guys and a lot of them got the best of him. So that is the illusion that we have to understand, that there is no such thing as the greatest of all time. Even George St. Pierre mentions this. He says that I was only the greatest of all time within that time and that date that I was presented of when I was going to compete. And that he exactly did in terms of his performances and his accolades that he's accumulated over the years. But the one thing that he understands is mortality within a human being, the limits of man. And when you understand that, well, then you have a better understanding of your own ego, and you have a better understanding of your own success, whether it would be luck or based on grind or based on just pure combinations of different variations that gave you that championship win in the likes of Sean Strickland, where preparation and the right timing came at the perfect form in order for him to have the moment that he did. And then at some point, somebody's going to get the best of him, because you know that he's not the best, but you know that there's always somebody else out there in a horizon waiting to take the gold. But that's the reason why we keep coming back for more, is because the storyline goes on. It doesn't end from here. It's a great fairy tale for you now, riding to the top, but at the same time, there's always somebody else in a horizon waiting to take you out. But in reality, that's really the difference between MMA and boxing, is that we can actually see that in MMA, whereas with boxing, there's a lot of politics involved and a lot of barriers that prevents us from really understanding who the best is and understanding true meritocracy at its best form.